Hello, welcome back. I'm Savalian. I make videos about games, development, and creativity, and we are in the midst of Game Dev December, which is not like a formal whole thing. It's just for the past couple of years, this year and last year, I'm doing game dev work every day in December, at least until Christmas, because I do kind of want a little vacation, just a little tiny one. But this is another vlog about how that's going, and this week was a rough one. So before starting this current project, which is a fishing game that I'm still kind of designing, and I'm making it in Godot, and before starting this project I had not ever used Godot for anything. I did like a little bit of research, I did some exploration into how the 3D stuff worked, and then this week I've actually started getting into the code, which I didn't learn about as much. I mean, I guess because I do have like a decade of software engineering experience, so I thought, how hard could it be? And honestly, things have not been that bad, but I'm definitely coming up against the problem of coming from one sort of mindset, the way that Unity does, you know, their game objects, their components, how they sort of pass information to different things, and then Godot being very different, with these nodes, and each of the nodes is sort of one complete unit, and I'm having a time wrapping my head around how it all works. So let's get into it. I'm going to talk about the features that I tried to work on, how things kind of went wrong, and the things that I learned from that, and hopefully I'll actually get a little bit of game work done, and we can see the fishing system, the fishing feature, start to come together. Before I actually got into the code, on Sunday of this week, I had my first day where I was just really not feeling it. It had been a long week, and frankly, whenever anyone commits to something like this, or like NaNoWriMo, or like the 100-day challenge, where you do a lot and you do it on a daily basis, it's good to accept early the fact that there will be days where you just don't want to do it, and come up with ways to keep the challenge going without it making it a problem, making it too hard. So I didn't push myself too hard. I made a cute little fish in Blender. It was what sounded fun at the time, and it was. I'm really happy with this little guy. It took me about 30 minutes, and most of that time was just spent playing around with the colors. So, an easy day, and sometimes that's just what you need. The first challenging thing I tackled this week was adding fishing nodes and starting in on the fishing system. My vision for the fishing nodes was a transparent object that activated the water shader's outline so that I could have these kind of foam ripples in the water. But the material that I made did not work the way I was expecting, and I realized pretty quickly I'm just not good enough at shaders to understand how to get this effect that I want. So I didn't want to spend a lot of time on this. When my first attempt didn't work, I switched gears and I just did what I could do now. So I ended up with these glowing circles that slowly expand and contract, and if I, in the future, if I want to adjust these, I can come back to this problem later. And I do want nodes where the player can fish instead of just making all the water fishable. And this is for a couple of reasons, but the biggest one is because of how I'm structuring the fishing runs. So they're meant to be kind of roguelite in nature, where you proceed through like a randomly generated, dungeon, for lack of a better word. And so each of these islands has an end point. You can't just fish here forever, because that would kind of ruin the pacing, I think, of the game. And without limiting the available fish, I don't have a good way to create that forward momentum. So I'm doing it with these limited fishing nodes. Each island will have a number of nodes, and the nodes, I think, will either run out of fish eventually, or they'll have a requirement that will run out, like maybe you need specific bait or something, just so the player will exhaust them and then have to move on. When creating this little expanding circle, I did get my first taste of Godot's built-in animation tools, and it's not bad. It feels about the same as Unity's, where you just have this little timeline, and then you add keyframes for different properties. Nothing crazy here. I don't use the in-engine animation tools very often. For simple objects like this, where I'm animating the whole object and there's not a lot to it, this is fine. But if I was rigging anything that was like skinned or had, like, had complex parts, I would definitely want to do that in Blender. This next part is where things got tricky for me. With Unity, it was always very easy to grab components off of game objects, and I was comfortable getting references to different things, finding components by type, and understanding the structure of information in Unity. And so Godot, I really don't have that experience. And it works pretty differently. I'm still getting used to it, but the way that I understand it, there's not an easy way to search like child nodes, kind of the way you would get component in children on a Unity object. And it seems like you either have to do that search very manually and like iterate through all the children and do your checks, or you have to know in advance the path to the node that you want. And the desired functionality that I was trying to get here is that the player gets in range of a fishing node, and then they can hit a button to interact with it. And eventually this will start the fishing minigame, but for now I really just want to get that interaction working. And so because I felt a little bit out of my depth, I wasn't really understanding the process of getting the type of node that they were next to and communicating that to the player stuff so that it could go into the fishing system. I was a little lost, so I used a tutorial for an interaction system. I'll link it if I can find it. I unfortunately don't remember who made the video. But they suggested that I use get node in group or get first node in group to get the player. And it was working, and then it wasn't. And I'm still not sure if I did something to break it or if the get node in group functionality is bugged somehow, because I double checked. The object was in the group, it was in the scene, it should have been available, but it was simply not finding it. It was just returning null. So instead of trying to sort of force Godot to work the way that I wanted it to work, getting these nodes by group or sort of finding them through a search, I embraced how I understand Godot to work, and I reorganized my node hierarchies within my prefab scenes so that I could just use a known path. And I'm gonna try to keep this in mind going forward as I create, these prefab scenes. I'm gonna remember that I need to be able to find nodes by path. I should understand what they need to do. I'm gonna take time to separate functionality into smaller specific nodes so that when I need to do something, I know exactly which part of a scene is responsible for doing that thing. And so I think having this design concept in mind as I go forward, I think it's just gonna make it easier to work with Godot. And of course, there's probably other ways to do the things that I'm trying to do that are a little bit more flexible. But I'm just gonna do it the way that I know works so that I can keep making the game and keep progressing forward. As I was working on the interaction detection, I also started building up the code that would handle the fishing state at the same time, and I kind of went back and forth with both of these systems so that it wasn't like I finished one and then finished the other. So the video is going to be a little bit messy. This was a messy week for me. It was a lot, and I worked almost exclusively in code, so there's not much to look at. So I iterated a lot on this, but in the end I have a pretty simple system. So I've talked a lot in the past in my Unity videos about separating the logic code from the code that handles the visuals and the engine interactions. And I'm doing the same thing here whenever I can. And I had a hard time naming a lot of these scripts, so don't judge me for that. But I made a script called fishing feature that basically handles the state that the fishing is in and the transition between those different states. So when an interaction on a fishing node is detected, this activates a function in the fishing feature code that determines if we need to transition to a different state. And in the future, some of these transitions will be handled by the fishing minigame, but for now they're all connected to this interact button that I've got working. So if the player is idle and they interact, they will go into casting state. When the casting is done, they'll go into the fishing state. If they interact again, they will go into the reeling state for 2 seconds and then transition to fishing result, which is eventually going to be where they sort of hold up the fish and show it off, and then that'll go back into idle. And the separation concerns here means that the fishing feature does not know anything about the character, what the character's doing. It doesn't know anything about the animations that should be playing or the interaction system. All it knows is the current fishing state and when an interaction has taken place. I also learned at this point how to use signals that I've designed myself, so not just the default ones like the collider signal, but these signals actually kind of use C# events if you are using C#, but the syntax is different. So you have to define a delegate with a specific name, and that adds the signal to Godot's like signal stuff. And then in order to trigger that event, you have to use a special function called emit signal, where you pass the name and then any parameters that it might have. So I've done that here, where every time the fishing state changes, we are emitting that state change. And then on the other side, the character movement script is listening for these state changes so that it can play the correct animation and also stop movement while the player's fishing, so they can't be mid-fishing and like running around. So in here we have a very similar function where we subscribe to the fishing state changes, and then depending on the state we set certain animation variables. I still find the Godot animation tree a little bit cryptic. I feel like I'm having to do too much like setting animation parameters back to false for like a state machine, but maybe I'll come back and refactor this later. And after getting this all hooked up, I had a full loop for fishing, but this did take me all week. And I mention this because it can be a little disheartening when you run into setbacks as you're learning a new tool or a new programming language. It was starting to feel like I wasn't making any progress because I would spend whole nights just like looking at a zillion errors running up the console. But if you keep with it, if you take each problem one step at a time, you can eventually get through the other side, and you've learned a little bit more about how it all works. And it's worth it. It cannot feel worth it in the middle when you're frustrated, but it is worth it in the end to just keep pushing, keep picking, and keep learning. As a last set of features, I also added the ability to rotate the player towards the fishing nodes with the look at function. It's very, very similar to how Unity works. And then I added in the animations for the fishing rod itself. If you remember, when I animated the character a while ago, I think it was in October, I also animated the fishing rod so that it would bend when casting and reeling, so it's a little bit more realistic. And also the little handle thing, I don't know the word for it, would spin when reeling in the fish. And this is where I encountered another problem. It turns out there's actually a bug in the GLTF export in Blender 3. If you have selected objects as the export option, which I always use, it will export all the rigs in the scene instead of just the ones for the object you've selected. So what was happening was I exported this object trying to just get the fishing rod and its animations, but the character bones from the character rig were all included in the file. And I didn't want all these extra objects in that little scene because it's supposed to just be the fishing rod, so I excluded them on import. But because the bones were also for some reason connected to the animations would bug out because it couldn't find all of these character bones that it was expecting to find. So upgrading to Blender 4 fixed it for me. It was a smooth update so far, but I spent a lot of time Googling on this because I wasn't expecting Blender to be buggy. It's always been so reliable. You know, I've been using Blender for an extremely long time, since I was probably about 15, 16, which was a while ago. And it's always been so stable. And when it hasn't been stable, it's been fixed pretty quickly. So I'm always surprised when there's like an actual bug. And that's what I got done this week. A big stepping stone towards the main feature of my game, actually catching the fish. And now that I have the framework for this fishing system, with all the states defined and some of the transitions built out, I can start to actually add in the fish and the data structures around how I want to generate different types of fish, handling some of the randomness and the rarity and all that. So I'm very excited because we're really getting into the meat of, the core feature of this game, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I can also start building out the fishing minigame soon. I'm not sure which of these things I'll do first. I'll probably just go with my gut and do what feels like the most fun when I sit down to do some work. But it feels really good to see the progress. And that's why I love a monthly challenge like this, because even though it is hard to stay consistent, if you do, you will see things happen a lot more quickly than, a more casual effort at something like this. And so seeing the effort that I put in actually produce results is very motivating, and it helps me keep going. But that's all I have for today. I hope you'll like this video and subscribe, because I'll be back soon with another video, and I hope to see you there. Bye bye!